Okay, welcome to the special meeting of the San Ramon Valley Unified Board of Education meeting on May 22nd. We are here to do a budget workshop and then we'll go to closed session where we'll work on superintendent's evaluation. We do not plan on coming back out. It's just a working closed session. So let's do a call to order. Don't have a pledge of allegiance. Ready to begin? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, can we do attendance? We'll start, Jesse?
Yes. Jesse Van Z, Area 1, San Ramon Unified.
Shelley Clark representing Area 2.
I'm Laura Bratt, representing Area 3.
Rachel Hurd, representing Area 5.
And I'm Susanna Ordway, representing Area 4.
Then we have Dr. John Malloy, Dr. Stella Kemp, and Evan Miller. Not all here. Okay, so with that, let's accept the workshop agenda as well as the closed session agenda.
I move to accept both agendas.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
The motion was made by Board Member Clark and seconded by Board Member Van Z. Roll call vote. Board Member Van Z.
Aye.
Board Member Clark.
Aye.
Board Member Bratt. Aye. Board Member Hurd.
Aye.
Board Member Ordway.
Aye.
The motion passes 5-0.
Okay, we do not have any public comment cards on agenda item 5.1, which is the budget workshop. So let's move along.
Hey, good evening, trustee. Good evening, trustees. Can you hear me okay?
Right, I don't feel very loud either.
Okay. So this is the first time that I believe, if I'm correct, that we have done a budget study session prior to the bringing forward the budget for the board's consideration. We're working on the budget right now. And this past Friday, we had a session with School Services of California where they laid out the details for this year's budget in greater depth, but also looking at the out years for the state of California. Kind of some things and considerations that are coming out of the governor's office and the legislative analyst's office, LAO. And School Services, who we're a member of their group, provides a lot of information to us to help us with planning. So tonight at this particular study session, go on to the next slide. What we want to do is we want to talk to you a little bit about and share what we've learned about the economic indicators, because those economic indicators help us as we're planning out for subsequent years. So it's kind of some projections that we need to consider in the out years, along with what's going to happen this year, given some changes that are happening in the state, including the deadline for when folks pay their taxes. I don't know about you, we have not yet filled out our taxes, so we're taking advantage of the delay or the extension rather. But we want to talk to you also about the district's fiscal story. So what is that going to look like in 23-24 in terms of revenue, expenditures, the MYP and our fund balance, what that is going to look like. And then at the end, we're going to spend a little bit of time, most of our time, I hope, discussing the strategic priorities and some work ahead for us during the 23-24 school year to help us plan for 24-25 and beyond. So with that, I think we're going to go on and we want to show you we'll talk about some themes that we're seeing. So as we have been following the information that's been coming out from the state, in particular last Friday, we heard three major themes. Is that we're kind of in an economic recovery, but it's really kind of tenuous right now. They talk about it's kind of balancing on a pinhead. We've got large inflation. Inflation is pretty high, although it's coming down. There's some likelihood that we're going to go into recession. Some of our highest paying taxpayers in the state of California are leaving the state, and IPOs are at their lowest level since 2008. So there's uncertainty about what the state's budget's going to look like. And in fact, they told us on Friday that there is a likelihood that there will be $11 billion less than what they project in the May revise. So with this extended income tax deadline, they're really uncertain about what the revenue is going to look like. And so there might be some updates that are coming to us. And it's highly possible that they might have a revise in January. So billion statewide, yes. And of course, the state is experiencing declining enrollment, as we are as well. We'll talk to you a little bit about the declining enrollment and the impact on the district and what we can do as a district to mitigate this enrollment decline. So with this, we've invited John Gray to join us today. And we actually have the opening part of the presentation that was shared with the business leaders and also union leaders are present all across the state to hear this. So I'm going to talk to you about the themes and what to, we can't say it any better than John. So I'm going to hand it over to him.
So the May revision actually recognizes a $31.5 billion budget deficit. And despite that budget shortfall and economic uncertainty, Governor Newsom protects investments in education, although not without a few trade-offs, which we'll talk about in depth this morning. Now, echoing the same warnings that he had in January regarding continued economic uncertainty, we need to think about what could happen if his economic forecasts are overly optimistic. And so in the state's budget toolkit are things such as deferrals, reserve account withdrawals, and deficited COLAs. Now, when we think about the state economy, we think about the state budget. The Governor Newsom does really highlight the volatility of our progressive tax system here in California, which really is so dependent on our highest wage earners who have been hit hard by a nearly 20% decline in the stock market. We're also see a number of risks related to the delayed receipt of nearly $42 billion in personal income tax and corporate taxes, coupled with an interest rates increase, the uncertainty about the debt ceiling and the arguments around that in Sacramento. Again, those things create additional uncertainty in this May revision. Juxtaposed against reductions in the minimum guarantee are increases in LCFF and Prop 98 reserve obligations. And so depending on the accuracy or inaccuracy of the governor's optimistic budget forecast could really disrupt the balance between these seemingly opposed financial circumstances. So this all makes it difficult for you locally to communicate your budget story. The budget really is in the details, and effectively communicating the who, what, where, when, and how of the state budget will be challenging, but really key to helping your local community understand the risk to the education budget and the need for prudence in adopting your 2023-24 local agency budget. So while the administration and the legislature are negotiating the budget, you'll be back adopting your local agency budget, as well as hiring or recruiting and staffing your schools for 23-24, completing and updating plans, and meeting and negotiating in good faith with your labor partners. During today's presentation, we're going to talk about all of those topics and many more. And we're going to start this morning with John, who's going to provide an overview of the state budget and the state economy. John.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And I think this is probably the big story. Way back when Bill Clinton was running against the first George Bush Sr., he had an advisor, had a famous quote, and he said, "This is all about the economy. It's the economy, stupid." And so that's a famous quote. I remember it because I was around to hear it. Most of you weren't around at that time. So I'm going to talk about the economic situation we find ourselves in. We had many years after we finally recovered from the Great Recession where we had the wind at our backs. State revenues were coming in predictably. They were coming in well. We were able to plan, execute our budgets at the state level and also at the local level. Governor Newsom followed Jerry Brown, had the wind at his back at first few years. We hit the pandemic and a little bit of chaos, but we recovered nicely. And now we're back in the situation where we really need to watch what's happening with the US economy and the state economy and how that translates into revenues for the state of California and ultimately get into Prop 98 and eventually in your coffers. So I'm going to start with the big picture. We always start with the national outlook. We're looking at GDP. It's one of the broadest measures of measuring how well the economy is doing. And you can see in 2020, those big downstroke, big upstroke, we all went through that. And then things seemed to kind of iron themselves out. And we had some pretty good growth through 2021. Then at the beginning of 2022, we had those 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Typically, that's called a recession. We didn't call it a recession, but we did bounce back. So look at those last 3 bars. That's what's concerning. That shows the amount of growth for the third quarter in 2022 all the way to first quarter 2023. So what we're seeing is the growth is slowing. It's decelerating. And so again, this is one of the broadest measures of how we grade how the economy is doing. Now, this is probably the most positive chart I will show you in the next few slides. And so if you want to end on a high note, you might want to turn off your speaker or my speaker for the slides that follow it. But this is unemployment, both at the national level and at the state level. You can see California is that golden color. Pretty much mirrors what happens nationally. We tend to lag a little bit and we tend to be a little bit higher. And so we're back at a very low unemployment rate. That's good news. We want people working. When they work, they pay taxes, they buy things, they pay sales tax. It's good to have people working. What's not on this slide is the labor participation rate. And so right before the last Great Recession, we had a labor participation rate of about 66%. Very good. 2/3 eligible are participating in the workforce. Well, that went down significantly during the pandemic when we had shut down everything, but it rebounded pretty nicely. But we're still not back at the participation rate we had before the pandemic. And it might only be like 1%, but remember, small percentages applied to big numbers are big numbers. So this is my positive slide. All right, let's talk about inflation. We've been talking about inflation for a couple of years now. We saw it peak at 9.1% in the summer of 2022, and then now currently about 5%. And yes, it's going down, but remember, prices are still inflating, just not as high of a rate as it was at its peak. And so right around 5%, things cost more. The cost of doing business goes up. And one of the federal government's primary responsibilities is making sure we control inflation. And they have one primary tool they use to do that. And that's moving around the federal funds rate, which impacts pretty much all lending rates, mortgages, commercial loans, that sort of thing. So on this chart, you can see those gray areas. Those were recessions. And if you look at the Fed rates heading into those gray bars, it's the Fed typically raising the rates to combat inflation. And so if you look at 2000 or right about 2010, what's happening currently, you always see a significant rise in interest rates right before a recession. So on the far right, you can see that, yes, the Fed is continuing to raise those rates. Big question is, where do they go from here? Is it having an impact? And on the prior slide, I think we showed you, it is having an impact, but 5% inflation when it's been historically around 2% still isn't where we want to be. So what happens when interest rates go up? Usually has an impact on the stock market. This is really important for you to watch and understand. Because in California, Suzanne, with our progressive tax system, it's really important how our high earners do, right? And a lot of them don't have a daytime job. They make their money in the stock market. Our PERS, our STRs are also in here. And so you can see it took a dive during the pandemic, recovered significantly, but again, it's down again. And so this chart shows the peaks, the lows. And so right now, Standard & Poor's is about 14% off its high, Dow Jones about 9%. And again, with that theme, those percentages applied to big numbers for our wealthiest Californians is pretty significant. Housing market. Well, I showed you the Fed rate going up. Well, what happens to mortgage rates? They go up. That dotted line, you can see how mortgage rates have been going up. You can see both nationally in California, how home sales got really robust and now they're starting to slow down significantly. So as you look to the right, that dotted line, as that goes up, the activity or the change in activity goes down. And this is significant. The housing market is a big driver in the California economy and in the national economy. And again, it's going to cost you more to buy the same house than you could have, let's say, a year ago. And so that slows down the activity significantly. All right, we've been talking about this for a while, but we're going to keep talking about it because I think it's important. Often thought to be the biggest predictor of whether or not we're going to go into a recession is inversion of the yield curve. Simply said, short-term treasuries yield a higher interest rate than 10-year treasuries. Typically, the further you go out, the higher the interest rates go. But currently, a 2-year is a higher interest rate than a 10-year. So when you see those arrows, that's when the jaggedy line goes below zero. That means that the 2-year is at a higher interest rate than the 10-year. So you can see those gray areas, those are the recessions that follow. And you can see to the right, far right, that's where we are right now, and we are significantly below that line. And if you just look at trends, past analysis, it warns that we could be into a possible recession. Okay, this is another thing that we really need to keep our eye on. The crisis in the banking sector. We've had some significantly large regional banks basically go insolvent. And, you know, the mistakes that they made are the mistakes that others have made in the past. And you would hope we would learn about that. They got too many of their investments out there many, many years, 10, 20 years to get a higher interest rate at the time. But with interest rates growing the way they are, the value of those investments are down, right? If they had to sell those investments, they would take a loss. And so what's happening is the primary focus of the bank is that when you go to take money out, there's actually money there. So when I started in the early 90s, the big story was the Orange County Treasury. It basically went insolvent, and it was the exact same things. You want money in the treasuries so that you could access that money. But when you commit so much of it to mature way out there and people need their cash, that's where you have that crisis. And so we need to watch this one carefully. And again, the regional banks are primary lenders in your local economy. This is the one that makes me nervous, really nervous. And this is the net migration. We got this chart from the PPIC. They came out with it in March. It's really a good read. But look at those lines. It shows the net migration between California and other states. And it's by income. So you can see lower income for a long time have been relocating to other states. Typically, it's more expensive to live here. It's cheaper to live in other states. So that's always been an issue, and it's contributed, I believe, to our declining enrollment. Then you have middle income. But the one that I really worry about is we're losing a lot of higher income individuals. They're moving to other states, whether it be for social issues or economic issues, whether it's because we're now allowing more people to work remotely. All those things have contributed to us losing more and more high income individuals. And the bad news for us is those high income individuals tend to pay more in taxes that go into our coffers that end up at your local school districts. And so this is a real troubling indicator to me. And they have another chart that looks almost exactly like this, and it shows education level. We're losing a lot of well-educated Californians to other states. IPOs, initial public offerings, a significant source of revenue in the past for the California state budget. I remember in 2012, we were all waiting because Facebook was going to do its IPO. How much is Facebook going to generate? How much is going to end up in the state's coffers? And how much ends up in Prop 98? And I believe that one deal brought in about $12 billion to the state of California. But look how high it was in 2021, over 1,000 IPOs nationally, and about 40% of them were here in the state of California. And now, if you look to the right, a mere 2% of IPOs are occurring in California. They're occurring in other states. And, you know, we brought in basically about $16 billion a year for the last 5 years. And through September 2022, we're only at 177 million. Commercial real estate, if you drive around San Francisco, Los Angeles, or even here in Sacramento, you're going to see that there's a lot of vacancies, right? And this is troubling. When those buildings are full, the local economy tends to roll a bit better. The local restaurants that service them, the dry cleaners. But this vacancy rate really is a concern. And we have about $3 trillion in mortgages for these office towers that are going to come due, are going to need to be refinanced at a much higher rate. And so this could be the next big thing to tip us into a recession. It's these office vacancy rates. And as leases terminate, typical like us at school services use commercial office space, we all reevaluate how much space do we actually need in this new environment where a lot of work can be done in a remote environment. And so if you watch the press conference for the May revision, Governor Newsom, right out of the gate, said California is a progressive state. California is progressive on social policies, progressive on pretty much everything we do. And that includes our tax system. We have a very progressive taxation system, where the top 1% of our earners provide about 50% of the total funds we get at the state budget. And so it's important, all those slides I showed you, they all are individual economic indicators, but at the end of the day, they impact how much money comes into our state budget. And so I'm going to turn it over to Patty Herrera, who's going to talk about what is the impact of all the things I just spoke about actually to the state budget and the budget that the governor is forecasting going into next year. So Patty, you want to take it from here?
Yes, please. So thank you, John. I think John was trying to emphasize that our state budget and our general fund revenues rely heavily on the performance of our economy, both the US economy and then obviously specifically the California economy. And as John mentioned, many of the economic indicators outside of our unemployment rate are trending downward. And you can see this in what we call the big three taxes and the trend line in the big three taxes, particularly in 2022-23 and 23-24. Particularly compared to the peak in 2021. So you can see those last two bars are trending downward. So what we're seeing here is the economic impact that is happening on our state revenues that the governor is having to contemplate as part of his May revision. It's hard to ignore the trends across our big three tax revenues, which make up 96% of all state general fund revenues that we use to build our state budget. When we compare it to pre-pandemic levels of 1819 or 1920, we have grown significantly in our overall state revenues. But when we're thinking about and budgeting year over year, we are feeling a plateauing of our revenues, and we're going to feel that as well when we look at Proposition 98 revenues specifically. So as you all know, and as John noted, and 62% of our general fund revenues are generated from personal income taxes. and 50% of those taxes are generated from our highest income earners, we really look at personal income tax and the projection of personal income tax when we're thinking about what is the budget going to look like next year. So we wanted to look at the trends every single year. How much do we raise every single month in personal income tax? Because April is typically a driver in terms of how well we're able to project state revenues for the following year. So this year, you all know that we have a huge blind spot because of the significant deferred tax deadline from April to October. So we phoned a friend. You all know we called Robert and we like, Robert, hey, you know, what do we do in this environment when we defer tax deadlines? And Robert responded and sent us back this picture. And he was like, I don't know. And I'm going to tell you this quick story. When I first showed this slide to John, he was like, why does Robert look like Spock? And I'm like, who's this Spock? I was like, John, that's the shrugging guy emoji. And if you all, for those of you who text John relatively frequently, you'll know that John is not very fluent in emoji, because the only one that I think he knows is the like plus, you know, the thumbs up sign, because that's the only emoji that I ever get from John Gray. So he obviously didn't know the shrugging guy emoji, and I didn't know who Spock was. So there you go. So anyway, all of this is to highlight that you can see back in 2020, the last time we deferred the tax filing deadline to July, you can see that April revenues only brought in 6%. Of state revenues at the time. And this creates a huge blind spot for predicting what our state revenues are going to be for the budget year. And we're in that situation again this year. And as noted in an earlier slide, about $42 billion of the money that we project to be included in the May revision are outstanding in the fall. And we're going to talk about where that is. So as we've been talking about in terms of personal income tax, you can see from this slide that the May revision contemplates a pretty sizable reduction in estimated revenues, not just from January to May, but frankly across the budget window. Just over the last 2 years alone in the May revision, the governor estimates that personal income taxes are down by roughly $15 billion from his January projection. So this is significant because we just told you how much we rely on personal income taxes for all of our general fund revenues. And of those taxes that are included in the May revision, still 25%, about 25% of those revenues are estimated to come in October. So this creates risk for our budget. We don't really know whether or not we're going to get those revenues in October. The corporation tax, you can see year over year from 2022-23, pretty steady, right? Not a big change, but still down $3 billion from 2021. Again, that was the peak in terms of our state revenues in 2021, and we are showing a downward trend in corporation taxes. Like personal income tax, some corporation taxes are deferred until October, and the governor estimates that over 30% of corporation taxes that are included in his May revision estimates are outstanding to October, to that deferred deadline. So again, creates a blind spot for us and also creates risk for our budget, not just the state budget, but as I'm going to show you when I cover Proposition 98, our education budget. Sales tax, like John was talking about in terms of his employment slide being sort of the most positive slide he was going to be presenting to you. Sales tax is our most positive economic slide or revenue slide that I'm going to be presenting to you today. You can see across the budget window that it's pretty steady. Right? We're not seeing a drop. This is the smallest of the big three taxes that contribute to our overall state revenues. That's notable and not too much lower than the corporation taxes, but nevertheless, the smallest contributor to our big three taxes in our general fund revenues. When I look at this slide, it looks positive. But I will, as John noted, he said that the Federal Reserve has been taking action to tame inflation that we have been fighting for the last year and a half. So when I look at a steady stream of sales tax revenue, that tells me that consumer demand is still steady and is still high. When consumer demand is high, all that does is it pressurizes inflation. right? So you can look at this slide as positive, but you can also look at it as this is exactly what the Federal Reserve is trying to combat, right? Reduce demand to get more in line with supply. So maybe we'll see a trend, a change in that trend in terms of sales tax. So I love this slide. This is representative of my dear friend and colleague from the Legislative Analyst Office, Ken Capon. If you ever have the privilege of engaging Ken, you will know that he's one of the kindest, most trustworthy, one of the smartest people I know. And the LAO projects that our revenues are going to come in $11 billion lower than the governor's May revision estimates. And they say that there's a 2/3 chance that the May revision estimates are overly optimistic by $11 billion. So this is our tribute to our friends at the Legislative Analyst Office who, and we promised Ken that we'll come back in January and we'll see where the wheel lands, right, on Spin the Wheel. I hope Ken gets to enjoy that cartoon. So I got to tell you guys, we took a vote. Should we keep this slide? Should we jettison this slide? I voted to jettison this slide, and then John Gray made me present it. So this is the overall general fund budget, the summary for 2023 based on the governor's May revision. And despite the challenges and the $31.5 billion budget deficit that Suzanne highlighted earlier, the governor manages to present in the May revision a balanced budget. One of the things I'd like to highlight for you in this chart, I don't really pay attention to this chart, to be honest with you, is he does make a small withdrawal from a small reserve. That's the safety net reserve at the bottom of the chart. He takes out $450 million to help solve the budget problem, which is interesting because he doesn't dip into any of the other reserves, right? Not the larger state reserves and certainly not our Proposition 98 reserve. And we're going to talk about why that is later in our presentation. So as you all know, and as John noted, even though the GDP had dipped over 2 consecutive quarters, which historically has signaled that we're in an economic recession, no one had ever declared that the economy was in recession. And consistent with that message, the governor's May revision does not contemplate an economic recession. So his estimates, his revenue estimates, as optimistic as they may or may not be, do not contemplate a recession. However, his financial advisors at the Department of Finance did model what could happen to the big three tax revenues if we should go into a moderate recession. And if we do go into a moderate recession, the Department of Finance estimates that we could exacerbate our existing $31.5 billion deficit by an additional $40 billion. So this is something to watch. And again, we picked up on this chart because what we're highlighting for you is that this indeed, in our opinion, is the riskiest budget in a decade, right? Because again, the May revision doesn't contemplate a recession. And some people, particularly our friends at the LAO, believe that the governor's revenue estimates in the May revision are optimistic. So this is what John's been talking about throughout the economic presentation, is that our economy is balancing on the head of a pin. And it's going to, how the economy responds to future action by the Federal Reserve. Are they going to continue to raise interest rates, or did the banking crisis spook the Federal Reserve that they're going to pause interest rate hikes? And then how the macroeconomy responds to those decisions are going to determine what happens to our overall economy. Are we going to, gradually, are we going to stay steady? Are we going to go into a recession? And what happens over in the overall economy is going to impact our revenues, as you can see in the charts that we've been presenting. So the risk to the state budget, of course, in our opinion, is the gross uncertainty in our economy. And as John said, that is the story. We know that the performance of the overall economy also presents risk to your budget, right? Because as the state revenues are predicated on what some people would believe are optimistic revenues. Those revenues translate into Proposition $98, which of course support all of your operations locally. But we also know that your budgets have other kinds of risks, right? That you need to take note of and you need to mitigate against. So you all know this, declining enrollment creates risk for your budget. The anomalous attendance rate are also impacting your budget and creates risk. And then one that our friend later in the presentation is going to talk about is increased pressures on the cost side of your budget, or particularly employee benefits and compensation and how that's pressurizing your local budget. So these are risks that we identify for your budget in addition to the macro economy and what's happening in Proposition 98.
That was some bright and good news. It's a lot. It's a lot of information about a very complicated situation that's happening at the state. And what we want to do is sort of have you kind of keep that information as part of sort of the foundation of what we're getting ready to talk to you about in terms of how we develop the budget here and what we're looking forward to in the next years out. So when you think about the revenue for the school district, the first and the largest portion of revenue that we receive is through this local control funding formula. And there's factors that affect that particular formula: enrollment, the average daily attendance, our percentage of unduplicated students, which are free and reduced English learners, and homeless and foster youth. And then all of that is multiplied by COLA, cost of living adjustment. We receive other state funding. We still have some COVID and other one-time funding. The other state funding includes the Prop $28. Those are restricted because they're very specific. The COVID and some other one-time dollars are restricted. Some of them are unrestricted, but for the most part they're restricted. And then our local revenue, which we've been so fortunate to have the donations of our foundations. They contribute quite a bit of money to the district each year. And then our parcel tax, which is coming up for renewal in 2025. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Evan, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the numbers and what we have to look forward to.
Great, thank you, Stella. So this is another slide that comes from school services, but it lays out the revenue that we can expect from LCFF with the new COLA. So the governor has fully funded the 8.22% COLA. We wanted to show this partially because I think we want to make sure everybody understands that we get different amounts of money depending on the grade span of the students that are there. So K to 3 and all the way through 9 to 12, you can see what the 8.22% COLA does in the second row to give us a base grant for the upcoming year. There's the GSA stands for grade span adjustment. So our youngest and oldest students get an additional extra adjustment. And then finally down there on the 23-24 adjusted base grant for ADA. So we see how much we get for each student in each of the grade spans. We do not qualify for concentration funding, so the last row is not applicable to us, but with our 10% unduplicated counts, we do get the supplemental grant for ADA. So that is kind of in a nutshell how our LCFF funding will break down for the upcoming year if the budget is passed as presented by the governor.
So this slide, I know it's a little difficult to read it, but the slide shows our enrollment versus our average daily attendance. Prior to the pandemic, our ADA was close to 97%. And I think it's important to note because as a district, when you develop your budget projections, you budget project on 95% ADA. And so when your percentage is lower than that, it's like you're just coming in right on mark. Where before the pandemic, we actually had a surplus because our ADA was higher. And so the surplus that we've had for a number of years actually contributed to the larger fund balances that we had at the end of the year once everything settled out. now we're coming in, we're starting to see that that number is not producing the surplus we need. So next year, we said, okay, we need to pay attention to our ADA. We have our student services department is going to be focusing on an attendance initiative. We identified staff who are going to work with our site principals and our site teams, make sure that we're communicating to our parents the importance of being in school each day. And if you are not here, how do we go about recouping the attendance for the days missed? So they're working on that plan right now, but it will start with a communication campaign at the beginning of the school year.
And I like this slide because the previous slide shows the effect of the 8.22% COLA, but we know that the COLA is not the only factor that affects our LCFF revenue. This is another very big factor. And so as we have fewer students and lower ADA as compared to prior years, we'll see the effect on our LCFF revenue. So this is a picture of the past couple years. So 2021 and 21-22 are our actuals. 2022, the current year, 22-23 through 24-25, those are all based on our second interim. And then the final year, 25-26, will be part of our MYP for the adopted budget coming up. It's still in draft form, so these numbers may look slightly different, but we're pretty confident this is where we are. We wanted to show all four of those, enrollment, ADA, unduplicated percentage, and COLA, as the effects and show the effects on our LCFF revenue. So we see those numbers, and then LCFF revenue from the current year, 321 million. Next year, the combined effect of the COLA and our decline in enrollment, we are projecting revenue of about 338 million. So that's an increase of about 16.5 million. But it's not that full 8.22% COLA. So what we really want to highlight is that second to bottom row, LCFF change over the prior year. We're getting 5.14% more LCFF revenue this next year as compared to last year. The number that we'll hear lots based on that and they revise is 8.22. And what we really want to help people understand is that we're not getting 8.22% more LCFF revenue next year. It's going to be a smaller amount because of the effect of declining enrollment and lower ADA. So that's what we're trying to demonstrate with this slide, and then kind of to go deeper on that point, we've kind of broken out the effect just on our middle school students, and this is not so yeah, grades 4 through 6. It's a little bit more complicated for a unified school district because of those different levels of funding for different grade spans. To try to simplify it, we wanted to show that those dollars, you have a 9,304 base grant in the current year for our 4th through 6th graders. You add on the COLA, $765 per student gives us a base grant of $10,069. But when you combine that with our decline in enrollment and lower ADA, the increase for our middle schools is 5.89, so not an 8.22. So just another way of looking at how declining enrollment kind of affects our COLA. That's why we're calling it our declining enrollment COLA. And I think what we also want to be clear with here is LCFF, we get these dollars by grade span, but we don't necessarily spend them by grade span. They're fully unrestricted. So we do decide how to divvy them up at the district level. And so with those with that revenue picture and using again the second interim expenditure picture as well as an additional year in the MYP for 25-26 that we'll see at adopted budget, we wanted to show you what that looks like for our fund balance. Want to remind everybody that this is our combined fund balance, so it's both our unrestricted and restricted. So when you see an increase or decrease, that does not necessarily mean we are deficit spending on the unrestricted side. I mean, we are definitely in deficit spending on the restricted side. So as we get dollars in one year, we may spend them over, of course, a few years. But I think what we really wanted to point out here with this slide is 25-26. That's our new year of the MYP. We did not include the parcel tax in this projection, and that is one thing that I think we want to talk about in this workshop is how we want it to be presented at adopted budget. Because we do have a choice. We could put it in there, and in the criterion standards that we discussed at second interim, we would have to note that those are contingent revenues. We can't count on them yet because the voters haven't approved them yet. So we could put them in and show a different picture, or we could leave them out, which I think would be our staff's recommendation, that we can't count on those revenues until the voters have approved them. But it will mean that we will see a bigger decrease. It will look like we are deficit spending because that's what will happen if the voters have approved the renewal of parcel tax. So
Of parcel tax, not assuming it'll renew, make the case for it.
correct, we could show this will be the effect on our budget. It will show it very clearly in the adopted budget NYP that this is what happens when $6.8 million falls off the revenue side.
Evan, would this cause us to go into a qualified budget?
I'd have to look more closely because so the qualified budget depends also on your fund balance and if you can meet that 3% reserve requirement. So I'd have to look at it a little bit more carefully and do that analysis. I haven't fully, adopted budget is not fully baked yet, which is why I'm bringing second interim numbers here. But it would get us close, and I think as we continue down, as we progress through the years, we would definitely begin to see a qualified budget.
Guess we have to be careful about what the talking point is, right? Especially if we're demonstrating that we can be trusted with money, right? That we have to be careful. What are you looking at as the ADA number going forward?
So the ratio is about, we're keeping it about 95%. Do the math on that. We're right now, we are thinking that we'll lose about 400, I think it's 450 students a year. It is based on the Davis demographics, but also based on our current enrollment numbers. So our current enrollment numbers for next year are looking better than the Davis demographics gave us a conservative report, I think. And so we do have right now more students enrolled for next year. And so we've kind of adjusted along using the Davis as a guide that we know that next year is higher than what they did.
But the 95% attendance is kind of the standard planning.
Well, in the past, we did budget at a higher level, but because since the pandemic, those kids, we haven't been up to 95%, we are now budgeting at 95%.
Can I ask what percentage we've been at for ADAs post-pandemic?
It's been right at about 95%.
Right at about
So
95, okay.
those 2021, 21, 22 are at, 2021 is inflated because the state allowed us to use the prior year's ADA. And what we're really seeing then in 24, 25, as revenue flattens out, is that we are losing, we're doing a 3-year average of ADA now. When we lose that 100.72%, that's when we really say our revenues start to fall. And that's why here we see LCFF revenue 23-24 increase of 16 million, but then 24-25, it really it actually drops a small amount. That's the combined effect of the lower COLA, decline in enrollment, as well as losing that 2021 ADA from our average.
So if you go back to that last slide that you're showing. Yeah, so this is speaking to the point that we're talking about. It's if you're not factoring in the parcel tax renewal, which is approximately 6.8.
6.8 million.
But we've got a decrease of 12.2, 12.3. So that is that ADA mixed with the parcel tax.
And also, I think our restricted revenues as we spend those dollars. All right, so this slide, what we wanted to show is our LCFF change, knowing that we have those increased unrestricted dollars to play with or to spend in the year over year, and then some of the expenditures that we see coming into and filling and using basically over the course of the 3-year MYP. So the revenue lines are from that slide, a few slides back that show our LCFF revenue and our change. All it is a change from the prior year. So we'll see the big increase next year and then small decrease and then an increase. On the expenditure side, so turn the page is our cost of doing business. Step and column increases the bulk of that, but also some increased costs for utilities or other as inflation, as prices go up, other things will cost more for us. So we projected that out at $2.6 to $2.8 million a year. When we talk about the adopted budget in a couple of weeks, one of the things that the governor has done to fund that 8.22% COLA is to take away from the discretionary block grants that they awarded this year. He talked about it in January as well. And so when we brought the arts and music instructional block grant to you, we held 6 point some million, about a third of those dollars in reserve because the governor had signaled that he wanted to claw them back. In this January or in the May proposal, he has now proposed to cut that grant in half. So instead of holding back 6.8, we probably have to hold back about $10 million. So in addition to that, he did not touch the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant at the January proposal, and May revise. He has now proposed to hold back about a third of that to fund the COLA as well. So he's pulling back on the two big one-time grants that we got this year in order to fund his ongoing expenses. And so in 23-24, that $2 million is what we believe we will need to spend from what we had planned to spend out of the arts and music instructional materials block grant. Is basically the instructional materials. If you remember that revenues that you approved, it was for the one time that we paid this year, the cost of negotiations, the longevity increase that we'll be doing for next year for our certificated staff, and then PERS and STIRS increases. That eats up, and then some vehicle purchases, and that eats up about $10 million, which is about the money that we think we're not going to get. So the next $2 million or so we wanted to spend on instructional materials. We believe we still need to make those purchases of instructional materials, and so we are moving those into the unrestricted general fund. I think that is part of the risk of the budget that school service is talking about is exactly that not only is he projecting what might be a very rosy scenario as far as the upcoming recession and his revenues, which they can't project right now because of the tax deadline, but also that he's using one-time monies to support it. I think what he has done is he's held back on spending reserves. So he does have that kind of in his back pocket. If there is a recession, he knows he has his reserve accounts, the public school stabilization account, as well as the other general fund reserves. So I think when you have this problem, you will find any solution. Reserves are also one time. So if he pulled from reserves, that would also be a one-time solution for an ongoing. So I can understand at a state level why he made this decision, but it does impact us. The clawback in 25-26 is basically the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, where we thought we would be able to pay for a couple years of liaisons. We now think we will probably only be able to pay for liaisons in the upcoming year using COVID dollars, and in the following year using that Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant. Then they will come to the unrestricted general fund. So that's at $4.5 million. We have some ongoing site and department increases that we think are in there, and then ongoing expenses currently covered by one-time COVID grants. The bulk of these are one-to-one devices. There are also some personnel costs in there. There are also summer school costs in there that we know as we use up those funds will come back to the unrestricted. So when we put all those things together in the first year, we're still seeing an increase in LCFF that is more than all those things that we think are going to come back into the general fund. So we still have a balance of $9.8 million of new dollars. So this is just when we're looking at a snapshot of new dollars. The following year, that balance gets eaten or mostly eaten up, so 2.2 million, and then by that third year, this is, we're seeing now a decrease. So if we made no choices and continued to spend exactly as we have, as we are currently, we would be seeing a deficit by that third year.
That number is missing the parcel tax.
Correct. This is looking only at
That's
unrestricted.
helpful to know.
LCFS.
That's a 6.8 difference. If the second.
Correct.
Can I ask a question about the declining enrollment in relationship to staffing? So if we have declining enrollment, are we factoring in any reduction in staff?
We do.
The equation?
On the certificated side, we do reduce our staffing every year based on our enrollment numbers. So it's, we take the same ratio that we use to staff, we reduce our FTE by the price.
That's usually handled by attrition, right? It's not like.
It has, I think, historically, we have been able to handle it by attrition. And
If we have to take a look at a couple of things. When you have declining enrollment, is really analyzing and watching your boundaries. And this is one of the things that we'll be doing in the fall, is doing a boundary study to identify, where the changes are happening, whether we need to move some of the boundaries, because we also have the development that's happening in Bishop Branch, and we need to prepare for that as well.
anyway, so I think this slide is really that last bullet point. With limited resources, we may have some difficult choices coming up.
Okay, so this kind of, preps the field for what we need to do for next year. You've seen next year's budget, looks like we'll have some additional revenue from the state. But looking out 24, 25 and 25, 26, we're gonna have to do some things to prepare for this. So we'd like to form a budget committee. Evan and I talked about this today. And then in this budget committee would have representation. We'd really look at what's a core staffing for all of our schools. We need to identify what is the necessary and absolute expenditures that we need to have in out years, like, one-to-one devices. Are we going to continue that? What about curriculum adoptions? What about software adoptions? What about infrastructure that we have to do to run the background on safety, security, for example? Those new expenditures that frankly we weren't budgeted for that. We didn't receive additional funding. We need to look at our management staff. We need to look at non-classroom site support. What's the impact of those? Have we gotten the services? Are we, what's going to happen? Like, what's the design for this in the out years? We also need to look at how are we utilizing our systems in the district to ensure that we're getting the kinds of efficiencies that we want out of them. Do we have any redundancy in the systems? We need to look at different contracts, consultant contracts, and services that we're bringing in from outside to make sure that those services are not duplicating something that's already inside the district that we're providing for. And then I think the last big thing is really looking at, can we grow revenue streams? We're not a district that has generally applied for grants. We don't really qualify because our unduplicated count is so low. But there are foundations out there that are interested to support school districts that are going through transformation efforts. We are one of the lighthouse districts here in the nation. I think we could, go to some of the larger foundations that are working in this arena, see if they want to support some of the work here, continue to support the work that we've already started. Local funding, as you know, we have great fundraising, parcel taxes coming up, and then the last but not least is improving overall student attendance. So these are some of the areas that we right now have on the radar. Open to any other suggestions that you might have as we begin preparing for 24.
What would the budget committee look like? Would that be parents?
Yep, we don't know yet.
Okay.
We'd like your input on.
Okay.
that, yes. It's more like a study group. That
As
we
opposed to
study
like a
this-
steering committee, it would be
Yeah, it'd
more
be more like a study group that would make recommendations for cabinet's consideration. Study some of the things, investments that we've made to see what the impact is. Because ultimately we may have to come back to prioritization. We want to have as much data as we can and have the buy-in of our community when we have to make decisions.
None of this modeling takes into account.
Evan, do you want
Sorry.
That is correct. We base our budget off off his May revise, and his May revise has its risks. That's why we wanted to play the video of school services, because we thought they laid out those risks very nicely. And we don't want to be alarmist here, but I think it is.
I think, Jesse, the thing that we have to keep in mind is that if this comes to fruition, this big deficit, that we're lucky the state has a rainy day fund. I mean, Governor Brown was really wise in setting that up. That's number one. Number two is we do have the state minimum guarantee for schools. So we've got that Prop 98. So we know we're going to get this minimum guarantee. The third thing is that now I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, those are the two. January deferrals. So that could be the other piece. And I was working in Southern California when they did the deferrals between June and July. And those, kind of, it shows up a certain, it's just how the money is flowing. We're fortunate that in Contra Costa County, that the county actually will allocate some money, or actually, what do you call that? There's a term for it.
Because we're a teeter county, they allow us to actually have a negative fund, a cash balance, because they know that our property taxes will come to a higher rate. So they kind of carry the balance as a county, knowing that over the course of the year, it was always back. When I worked in Alameda County, that wasn't the case. Districts had to pay much closer attention to their cash.
And so you don't have to take out short-term loans. In order
There's no
to make
interest consequence for carrying.
There is, but I think it's worth it. And it's how we've always done it.
Or is it?
Since I've been here, it's been phenomenal because the interest rates have been so low. We'll see what happens, I think, now moving forward as interest rates come up. But in general, our interest has been much higher this year than it has been. So even taking into account when our cash balances get low.
And then let's say that $40 billion scenario does play out. What does $40 billion represent in a percentage? That's compared to
Be 60% of that 40 billion, right?
like additional.
To the district. Okay, well, to education funding is 60% of the state budget. So I don't know how that would show up for us. I mean, we could probably do back of the napkin for you.
I'm just curious as far as like kind of this as a potential scenario. This may be advised, but an additional $40 billion decrease is 5%. Yeah. But just for thinking purposes.
Even without that, we would be negative.
Yeah.
Well, remember the legislature is also doing their own budget as well. So they have a budget bill. And, they don't want any of the clawback, but there's consequences to that as well. So I think the biggest thing is that the governor is continuing to roll out his super concentrations. He's still rolling out that super concentration grant. So the additional dollars to school districts that have a high percentage of unduplicated students. So there's new funding the governor has proposed that the legislature is saying, don't fund that now. Let's just fund what we're obligated to fund, and we'll hold back on these other things. So we'll see. They'll meet somewhere in the middle.
Certainty is highlighted.
Yes.
So you mentioned that January, they might do another revision.
Well, it depends on what happens in October.
Right,
when they
so
settle.
if, let's flip the scenario, maybe be a little more optimistic. All the money comes in October and it's not as bad as what they had been projecting, because we all dug deep in our pockets and paid a lot of taxes. So what comes back to us then? I mean, how do they decide if they have more than what they thought?
What happens is, and I believe that they're always reevaluating, right? That's why those budget slides always show 3 years, because it's like the prior year, the current year, and the next year. And so they will just make an adjustment in the next year. If revenues come in much higher in a year than what they had budgeted, we'll see it in the next year. That's not always the case, though, because I think during COVID, everything shut down, they slashed everybody's budgets, and then in the middle of the year, they started to kick those back. So I think there are extraordinary cases where they will make the decision to do that. As they made the decision to spend lots of money when everybody shut down as a way to help keep schools and the economy right. So
And then you just catch up the next year, because you don't really want to open up negotiations again.
Well, it just seems with the clawback, if that happens, that would be some special circumstances.
Right. Well, the clawback is actually, we promise to send you a check, but we're not going to. So in essence, we've booked it already, but now we have to take it off the books, and they need to tell us how to do that as well, because there's a process with that. And you're right, because one of the clawbacks doesn't show up until 25, 26. So that might go away. Hopefully.
Exit it out here,
Yes.
giving you more money mid-year.
Yeah, and I feel like the decline in ADA it's money that we're leaving on the table, and feels like it's something that maybe we have a little bit more control over rather than declining enrollment, and that kind of thing. And when we look at historically, we were at that 20 or 97, 98%. Post-COVID, we're at 95%. And I know, as a parent kind of living post-COVID and seeing some things, I feel like there's room for improvement in a lot of ways that we support students so that there is a higher ADA. So I think that that's at least an opportunity that there isn't a lot of in other places in the budget.
As long as we're not encouraging kids to come to school sick.
No, oh no, that's not.
No, and I'm not saying that's what you said, but I think we have to be careful. It's the discouraging the vacations outside of break time, but not the, oh, suck it up, come to school anyway.
Right. Well, and I can give some examples. So I know at Cal, and I don't know if this is just a pilot program at Cal or if but there's the scanning system. And my kids don't miss a lot of school, and I get calls all the time because they scan in, but it doesn't work and this kind of thing. And then there's a process now where a parent can't just call and say my kid was there. There has to be a teacher's letter or signature or whatever. And it's a whole process. And so those become barriers. It's a barrier for me in fact, I'll just, I'm pretty honest, and I'm going to say that there have been multiple times this year that I did not call back because I knew my kid was in class, and it's like, I don't have time for this. And so that becomes that barrier. Right. And so it's things like that, and then I also know kids that they're having a really hard time being in the classroom. And that's social emotional, that's mental health, that's coming out of COVID and not yet having survived the pandemic, right? We talk a lot about how, we've survived a global pandemic, but I think there are students that have not yet survived it because they are not back to where they were pre-COVID. I feel like I'm not also, and so how do we help so that then our ADA can then get back to that 97%? Because essentially our ADA has not survived the global pandemic, right?
Is there any data on what's contributing to that decrease? It's probably by fast, right? It's mental health. It's being more reserved on sending your kids to school. They've got scratches, things, right? Is that clear?
All right. So with that, we are going to finish up the budget for the board, and we'll bring it back for public hearing can we go to the last slide? Just so we see the dates. Okay. So we're going to actually posting it a little bit later than May the 24th. We'll post it next week, probably on June 1st. We're gonna have the public hearing on June the 6th of the budget, then adoption on June the 13th. And 45-day revise in August. Our unaudited actuals for this year will come to you in September, or the first interim in December, and then the second interim in March. That's what we, and so if you have any questions or any clarification about anything that we're doing, as we get into next year with our sort of, planning for 24-25, we'll start that early in the year, forming a committee of, steering committee and advisory group that's going to take a look at different aspects of this. We haven't had too much dialogue, other than let's do it. But if you're interested to give some insight or input on, what to do based on, you know the community better than I do, we're happy to hear that.
And refresh my memory, we're looking to having a special election parcel tax March of 24. Was that kind of what we were? May. Okay.
And we do have a board budget committee still, don't we? Don't 2 members? Is that a designated liaison position anymore?
I was on it to begin with, and I don't think yeah, exactly.
Because I would think that if 2 board members were going to participate, the 2 that had raised their hand for that, assuming they still wanted to do it, would do that.
At least he's numbered.
We do have 2 cards, one for this item. So Taiwan's a country. Do you want to come up and talk about 5.1?
All right, thank you so much, President, for allowing me to speak. I really appreciate you. Okay, so I separated what I heard into out of my control, within my control. Out of my control is the extravagant and frivolous spending of the governor. And those uncertainties we cannot control. What I can control is to vote more conservative, so we're less progressive. And what I can control regarding parcel tax, I will make sure that I go out there and talk to other taxpayers, my neighbors, my friends, everyone. At least the renewal of the parcel will be able to pass. So your $6.8 million can be somewhat certain. I would do my part to do that. And the additional that you're asking, I think you might need a little bit more convincing, but after hearing all these data, I don't think it's that difficult. Honestly, as a taxpayer, if you want me to prioritize between everything that I have heard, I would definitely put education first. So you have my support on that. Losing 450 students, if it's based on the demographers, I'm assuming that it's coming out of the new births. So then it's affecting our TK, or is it across the board? This is just something for you guys to think about. You might want a little bit more detail, so you know how to staff. It's really not nice because I was a teacher before to hand a pay slip to teachers who were anticipating under back. Anything you guys can do to help a little bit more certainty for these wonderful human beings, please do so. And for ADA, if we drop 2% out of, I think we have what, 2,000 students, you guys said, or 4,000? Oh, that's a lot of. Okay, you guys need to do some deep diving into why these people are not. I'm thinking it could be the parental jobs got tossed up. So then maybe some parents are working night times. And so then if they're working night times, waking up early might affect their students. I don't know. It may not always be the student's problem. It could be the parent's problem. We need to do a deep dive. In that case, are you guys open to maybe having like either a weekend or a schooling for a certain group of people? And so then they don't need to worry about, either not learning or stigma or whatever. I mean, that's just something to throw out there for you guys. And I think that's all I have to say. Thank you on this night.
Okay. Anything else on the budget?
Just making a note. No, that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Appreciate
So before we go into closed session to work on the evaluation, we have a card on that. Go ahead. So, supervisor, superintendent Malloy, I just want to
Thank you so much again for coming all the way from Canada. Sometimes when I speak, I'm very, very direct. I'm a straight shooter, but that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate you. So I just want to make sure that everyone understands that I really appreciate you, and especially your leadership for taking us through the pandemic. That was the most critical time, and we survived. And of course, when we became physical, you have to deal with all these diversity. I don't think God himself can do much better than you did. So despite, sometimes you get criticisms from the conservative side, and, it's just part of, our democracy. When I was a kid growing up in California, I was on the other side. We were more conservatives, and people like me were more, liberal. And so I totally understand, and I appreciate you now gradually embracing more of our perspective and every little concession, empathy, understanding that you show us. We truly take it like we got a candy every single time we come. So thank you so much, and I'm really thank you.
So with that, let's go to closed. Go to John's office.